The busiest people often miss the moments that matter most, until one quiet voice makes the whole world stop. At exactly 7:45 on a chilly autumn morning, Daniel Brooks stepped out of the back seat of his black sedan without looking up from the schedule glowing across his phone. Every minute of his day had already been assigned. A breakfast meeting with investors, a presentation to the board, a charity luncheon that his assistant insisted would generate positive headlines, 3 conference calls before noon, 2 interviews before sunset. His calendar was so carefully organized that even unexpected conversations rarely lasted longer than 60 seconds. As the 38-year-old CEO of one of Boston's most respected investment firms, Daniel had spent years believing that time was his most valuable asset. People waited for him. Markets reacted to his decisions. Entire projects moved forward or stopped depending on a single signature. The revolving doors of the downtown office tower spun endlessly as executives hurried inside, carrying laptops and steaming cups of coffee, each person focused on another demanding workday. Daniel adjusted the cuff of his navy overcoat and started toward the entrance while his assistant, Rachel Collins, followed a few steps behind, reminding him that the board members had already arrived. The city moved with its usual rhythm. Taxi horns echoed through the streets. Buses released passengers onto crowded sidewalks. Morning sunlight reflected from rows of glass skyscrapers, turning the financial district into a landscape of silver and gold. Nobody noticed the little girl sitting quietly on a stone bench beside a large planter near the entrance. She looked no older than 7. Her light blonde hair rested gently against a faded red scarf wrapped carefully around her neck. She wore a simple cream-colored sweater beneath a pale blue jacket, dark jeans, and white sneakers that had clearly seen many walks through the city. Resting beside her was a small canvas backpack with a children's library card clipped to one zipper. She held one arm close to herself, not dramatically, but carefully, as though trying not to draw attention. Hundreds of people passed within a few feet of her. Some glanced briefly before continuing toward work. Others never looked at all. Daniel would have done exactly the same if the quiet morning breeze had not carried 3 barely audible words across the sidewalk. "It hurts." The whisper was so soft that it almost disappeared beneath the sounds of traffic. Yet somehow it reached him more clearly than the ringing phone in his pocket. His footsteps stopped. Rachel continued walking for another few feet before realizing he was no longer beside her. She turned, confused, watching the man who never paused unexpectedly stare toward the small bench near the building entrance. Daniel slowly lowered his phone. For the first time that morning, the glowing calendar disappeared from his attention. The little girl had not cried out. She had not asked for help. She had not called to anyone. She simply looked down at the sidewalk, holding her arm gently while whispering those same 3 words almost to herself. Daniel walked closer, kneeling until he was at her eye level. Her bright blue eyes lifted toward him with remarkable politeness despite the discomfort she was trying so hard to hide. She offered a tiny apologetic smile before quietly saying, "I am sorry. I did not mean for anyone to hear me." In that single moment, surrounded by expensive buildings, busy schedules, and hundreds of strangers rushing toward another ordinary day, Daniel suddenly realized that the most important appointment on his calendar had never been written there at all. Daniel studied the little girl for another moment before speaking. "My name is Daniel. What is yours?" She adjusted the faded red scarf around her neck and answered with a quiet smile. "Emma." Her voice carried remarkable calm, the kind that often belonged to someone much older than 7. Daniel noticed that she never complained. She simply sat very still, carefully protecting one arm while trying not to inconvenience anyone walking past. Rachel glanced anxiously at her watch before stepping closer. "Daniel, the board meeting begins in 15 minutes. Everyone is already waiting upstairs." He looked at the glowing screen of his phone. More reminders appeared. New messages arrived every few seconds. A financial analyst was asking for approval. His assistant had highlighted the morning presentation in red. Investors had already gathered in the conference room overlooking Boston Harbor. Every instinct told him to continue walking through the revolving doors and let someone else handle the situation. That was how successful people survived impossible schedules. They stayed focused. They trusted that someone else would stop. Daniel looked back at Emma instead. "Are you here with your parents?" he asked gently. Emma nodded toward the entrance of the neighboring medical building connected to the office tower by a glass corridor. My mom is inside for an appointment. She told me to wait right here because she did not want me walking too much this morning. Daniel noticed the small canvas backpack resting beside her feet. A children's library book peeked from the unzipped pocket, along with a neatly folded sheet of paper and a tiny reusable water bottle. Everything about her suggested preparation, responsibility, and quiet resilience. Did you tell your mother you were hurting? Emma lowered her eyes and softly shook her head. She already has enough to think about today. Those simple words settled heavily between them. Daniel felt something inside him shift. For years he had listened to adults negotiate billion-dollar agreements, defend impossible deadlines, and justify difficult decisions. Yet this little girl had spoken a sentence filled with more generosity than most boardrooms ever contained. Rachel gently cleared her throat again. Daniel, I really think we should go. He stood silently, staring once more at the crowded entrance where executives disappeared into elevators carrying briefcases and coffee cups. His calendar had always ruled his life. Meetings came first. Deadlines came first. Everything else waited. Until now. He unlocked his phone, opened the day's schedule, and looked at the endless chain of appointments stretching from sunrise until evening. Then, without hesitation, he handed the phone to Rachel. Please cancel every meeting. She blinked, certain she had misunderstood. Every meeting. Every one of them, Daniel answered calmly. Tell everyone something unexpected came up, because it did. Rachel searched his face for the slightest sign of uncertainty, but found none. Within seconds, she began making calls while Daniel returned his attention to Emma. He knelt beside the bench once again and smiled reassuringly. How about we make today a little less difficult together? Emma looked surprised. But you look important. Daniel laughed softly, a sound that even surprised him. Not more important than you are right now. For the first time that morning, Emma's careful smile became real, and as the crisp autumn breeze gently lifted the edge of her red scarf, Daniel realized that sometimes the greatest change in a person's life begins with the smallest decision to stay instead of walking away. Daniel offered Emma his hand, careful not to rush her. Would you like to go inside where it is warmer? Emma nodded, slipping her small hand into his before slowly standing from the stone bench. She moved carefully but never complained, adjusting the faded red scarf around her neck before picking up her little canvas backpack. Together they crossed the quiet plaza toward the connected medical building while Rachel remained several steps behind, calmly informing surprised executives that every meeting had been postponed. Daniel had never imagined that the most important destination of his day would be a hospital waiting area instead of a boardroom. The automatic glass doors opened with a gentle whisper, welcoming them into a bright lobby filled with soft morning light, comfortable chairs, fresh flowers, and volunteers greeting visitors with warm smiles. The calm atmosphere immediately slowed the hurried rhythm that usually controlled Daniel's thoughts. Emma looked around as though she knew every hallway by heart. We come here a lot, she explained quietly. Everyone is nice. Daniel noticed that nurses smiled when they recognized her. A volunteer at the welcome desk waved cheerfully. Good morning, Emma. Your mother is still with the doctor. It might be another little while. Emma smiled politely. Thank you. She never asked how much longer it would be. She simply accepted the answer with remarkable patience. Daniel guided her toward a comfortable chair in the family waiting area. Nearby stood a bookshelf filled with children's stories, puzzles, and colorful picture books for young visitors. Emma immediately noticed one book sitting slightly out of place. Before sitting down herself, she carefully returned it to the correct shelf. Daniel watched with quiet curiosity. You organized the books before taking care of yourself, he said gently. Emma shrugged with an innocent smile. The next child should find it easily. Those words stayed with him. They sounded so simple, yet they revealed a heart that always thought about someone else first. A nurse soon approached with a warm expression. Hello, Emma. I heard your arm has been bothering you again. Would you like me to take a quick look while your mother finishes her appointment? Emma looked uncertain for a moment before glancing toward Daniel. He smiled reassuringly. I will be right here. She nodded and walked with the nurse toward a nearby assessment room. Daniel remained seated, his eyes drifting toward the large windows overlooking the city streets where traffic continued moving exactly as it had all morning. Somewhere beyond those buildings, People were discussing investments, signing contracts, and attending meetings that had once seemed impossible for him to miss. Yet sitting in that quiet waiting room felt more meaningful than every conference he had ever led. A few minutes later, the nurse returned with Emma, who now wore a small supportive wrap comfortably around her arm. She should continue taking it easy today, the nurse explained kindly. Nothing unexpected, but she has been trying very hard not to let anyone know she was uncomfortable. Daniel looked down at Emma, who smiled apologetically, as though she had somehow caused extra work for everyone else. Instead of feeling sympathy alone, he felt admiration. This remarkable little girl had spent the morning protecting other people's feelings while quietly carrying her own discomfort. As sunlight poured through the windows and settled gently across the faded red scarf resting on Emma's shoulders, Daniel realized that true strength was often far quieter than the world ever stopped to notice. Daniel remained beside Emma in the family waiting area while the morning slowly unfolded around them. Parents quietly turned the pages of picture books with their children. Volunteers arranged fresh flowers near the reception desk. Somewhere down the hallway, a pianist played a gentle melody that drifted softly through the lobby, replacing the hurried rhythm of the city outside. Emma sat comfortably with the supportive wrap around her arm, her faded red scarf folded neatly across her lap. Instead of focusing on herself, she reached into her backpack and carefully removed the library book Daniel had noticed earlier. The cover showed a watercolor illustration of a small lighthouse standing beside a quiet sea. She smiled as she traced the edge of the pages. "This is my favorite," she said. Daniel leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "What do you like about it?" Emma opened to the first page before answering. "The lighthouse never leaves, even when the weather changes. It just keeps shining." Daniel thought about those words for a moment. His own life had been filled with movement. Flights, meetings, deadlines, endless calendars. He had always believed that success meant constantly moving toward the next achievement. Sitting beside Emma, he wondered if real strength sometimes meant simply remaining present when someone needed company. A volunteer carrying a tray of warm hot chocolate stopped nearby with a welcoming smile. "Would either of you like some?" Emma looked toward Daniel first before quietly accepting one small cup. Daniel accepted another. Steam curled gently into the morning light as they sat together in peaceful silence. After taking a careful sip, Emma wrapped both hands around the paper cup. "Warm things help people feel safe," she whispered. Daniel smiled. "Did someone teach you that?" Emma nodded. "My mom says warmth is not only something you drink. Sometimes it is something another person gives you." Daniel lowered his eyes toward the cup in his own hands. He could not remember the last time he had shared an ordinary moment with no expectation, no agenda, and no deadline waiting at the end. Nearby, another young child became frustrated after dropping several colored pencils onto the floor. Before anyone else noticed, Emma carefully stood, walked over, and quietly helped gather every pencil with her free hand. She smiled at the little boy and returned the box without saying anything about her own discomfort. The child smiled back immediately. Daniel watched the entire exchange without speaking. Emma returned to her chair as though she had done nothing remarkable. "You always think about other people first," he observed softly. She looked slightly surprised by the comment. "Everyone is carrying something," she replied. "You cannot always see it." Those simple words settled deeply inside him. For years he had judged people by performance, preparation, and results. Emma seemed to notice something entirely different. She noticed feelings before accomplishments, kindness before appearances, people before schedules. A few minutes later, the examination room door opened at the end of the hallway. A friendly nurse smiled toward Emma. "Your mother will be finished very soon." Relief quietly brightened Emma's face. She instinctively reached up and adjusted the faded red scarf around her shoulders once more. Daniel noticed how carefully she held it, almost as though it carried far more than warmth. Looking at the scarf catching the soft golden sunlight from the lobby windows, he realized it had already become more than a piece of clothing. It was a quiet reminder that comfort often arrived in the simplest forms, and that the most meaningful moments of a person's life rarely appeared on any calendar before they happened. The hallway door finally opened, and Emma's mother stepped into the waiting area with a gentle smile that immediately softened her daughter's face. She looked tired from the long appointment, but carried herself with quiet dignity. Her light blonde hair rested neatly over a simple gray sweater, and she thanked the nurse before walking toward Emma with open arms. Emma stood carefully and hugged her with one arm, making sure not to disturb the supportive wrap. "How did everything go?" her mother asked softly. Emma smiled. "Much better now." She glanced toward Daniel with grateful eyes. "I had company." Emma's mother turned toward the man standing nearby. "You must be the gentleman who stayed with my daughter." Daniel nodded modestly. "We spent the morning reading, talking, and waiting together." She extended her hand with sincere appreciation. "I am Sarah Parker. Thank you for giving her your time." Daniel gently shook her hand. "She has given me much more than I could ever give her." Sarah smiled with quiet understanding, as though she sensed there was more truth in those words than Daniel himself fully realized. Together, they walked toward a small cafe inside the hospital lobby where visitors often rested after appointments. The scent of fresh soup and warm bread filled the air while sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking a peaceful courtyard decorated with colorful autumn leaves. Daniel carried the tray while Emma insisted on carrying 3 paper napkins because, as she quietly explained, everyone should help a little. They settled at a table near the window. Conversation flowed naturally, free from business language or carefully planned agendas. Sarah spoke about Emma's love of books, neighborhood libraries, and their weekend tradition of reading together in the park whenever the weather allowed. Emma listened with a smile, occasionally adding cheerful details that made her mother laugh. Daniel found himself laughing too, surprised by how effortless it felt. For years, most of his lunches had taken place in conference rooms filled with presentations and negotiations. He could not remember the last meal where nobody checked a watch or interrupted the conversation with an urgent phone call. Emma reached for her faded red scarf and folded it neatly beside her tray before opening her backpack. From inside, she removed a small notebook no larger than a postcard. Its pages were filled with colorful handwriting, pressed autumn leaves, tiny sketches, and short thoughts written in careful letters. "What is that?" Daniel asked. Emma looked down at it with quiet pride. "Whenever somebody is kind to me, I write down what happened so I never forget how people can make each other feel." She slowly turned to a fresh page and carefully wrote today's date. Beneath it, she printed one simple sentence. "A busy person decided that I was worth waiting for." Daniel stared at the words for several silent seconds. No award hanging in his office, no newspaper article praising his company, and no financial achievement had ever touched him the way that single handwritten sentence did. Emma gently closed the notebook before wrapping the faded red scarf around her neck once again. Looking at her across the small cafe table, Daniel realized that while he had believed he was rescuing one little girl's difficult morning, she had quietly rescued something inside him that had been waiting far longer to be found. The afternoon sun settled gently across the hospital courtyard, turning the autumn leaves into shades of gold and amber as Daniel prepared to leave for the first time that day. Yet when he reached for his phone, he did not open his calendar. Instead, he looked at the list of missed calls with surprising calm before slipping the device back into his pocket. None of those conversations suddenly felt more important than the people sitting across the table from him. Sarah noticed the quiet change in his expression and smiled. "You look different than you did this morning." Daniel laughed softly. "I think I feel different too." Emma looked up from her little notebook with bright curiosity. "Can people change in one day?" Sarah answered before Daniel could speak. "Sometimes they can, if the right person reminds them who they were always meant to be." Those words lingered in the peaceful silence that followed. After lunch, Emma asked if they could stop by the small children's library before heading home. Daniel happily walked beside her through the bright hallway. The shelves had become busier than earlier that morning as young visitors searched for stories while parents rested nearby. Emma carefully returned the lighthouse book to its proper place, gently smoothing the cover before stepping back with satisfaction. Daniel noticed a handwritten sign hanging above the bookshelf that read, "Leave every story better." "Then you found it." He smiled because it somehow described much more than books. A volunteer approached carrying a small box filled with colorful bookmarks created by local elementary school students. "Would you like to help us?" she asked Emma. Without hesitation, Emma began placing the bookmarks inside dozens of books so each child would discover an unexpected surprise. Daniel joined her without being asked. Side by side, they quietly worked through the shelves, occasionally laughing whenever they found a bookmark with a funny drawing or encouraging message. The simple task felt strangely meaningful. There were no presentations, no contracts, and no applause. Only quiet moments that made someone else's day a little brighter. When they finished, Emma removed the faded red scarf from around her neck for just a moment and carefully folded it across the back of a chair. Daniel noticed a small stitched label inside the fabric with neat handwriting that simply read, "Love always stays warm." "Did your mother make that?" he asked gently. Emma nodded with a smile. "She gave it to me on my 6th birthday. She said whenever I feel scared or uncomfortable, I should remember that love travels with people, not places." Daniel looked at the scarf resting in the afternoon sunlight. Earlier that morning it had seemed like nothing more than an ordinary piece of fabric. Now it had become a quiet symbol of everything Emma carried with her every single day: kindness, hope, courage, and the ability to make other people feel safe even when she herself needed comfort. Before leaving, Daniel walked with Emma and Sarah to the hospital entrance where the cool autumn breeze welcomed them once again. Rachel was waiting beside the black sedan, holding a folder that had remained unopened all day. She smiled as Daniel approached. "The board wants to reschedule everything tomorrow." Daniel looked toward Emma, who waved cheerfully while wrapping the red scarf around her shoulders once more. "Tomorrow is fine," he replied. Today happened exactly when it was supposed to. As Emma and her mother disappeared slowly down the tree-lined sidewalk, Daniel remained standing for a quiet moment longer. Realizing that the most valuable investment he had ever made required no signature, no contract, and no financial return, only the simple decision to give another human being the one thing that could never be earned back once it was gone, his time. Over the following weeks, Daniel found himself returning to the hospital far more often than anyone at his office expected. At first, he told himself he was only checking on Emma after that unforgettable morning, but before long the visits became something he quietly protected on his calendar. Every Thursday afternoon, one simple appointment appeared between meetings. It did not include the name of a client or an investor. It simply read, "People first." Rachel noticed it almost immediately. She never questioned it because she had watched the change happen with her own eyes. The executives who once expected Daniel to rush from one conference room to another now discovered that he listened longer during conversations, asked employees how their families were doing, and stayed behind after meetings simply to thank people for their work. His company continued to succeed, yet the atmosphere inside the office slowly became warmer than it had ever been before. One crisp afternoon, Daniel arrived at the hospital carrying a canvas bag filled with brand new children's books. Emma greeted him with the familiar smile that always seemed to brighten the waiting room before he even reached the bookshelf. "You remembered Library Day," she said happily. Daniel placed the books beside the growing collection. Every good library deserves another adventure. Emma carefully arranged the books by reading level before sliding handwritten bookmarks inside each one. Every bookmark carried a short sentence of encouragement written in colorful ink. Daniel picked one up and read it quietly. "Stories remind us that hope always finds another page." He smiled and looked toward Emma. "Did you write all of these?" She nodded. "Some children come here feeling nervous. I thought maybe a surprise inside a book would help them smile." Daniel looked around the waiting room. Parents sat beside their children reading together. Volunteers laughed softly while organizing puzzles. Nurses paused for a moment to admire a little boy proudly holding his first library card. Nothing about the room felt extraordinary at first glance, yet every small act of kindness seemed connected to another, creating something much larger than anyone could measure. Emma sat beside Daniel and opened her little notebook. "Can I show you something?" she asked. He nodded. She carefully turned several pages until she reached one covered with neatly written sentences. At the top she had written, "Things that grow when you share them." Below it she had listed kindness, hope, courage, stories, smiles, and time. Daniel studied the page for a long moment. Most people would never think to put time on that list. Emma looked at him with quiet certainty. "But when you gave me your morning, you still had enough left to help lots of other people." Daniel suddenly realized she was right. He had once believed time became smaller every time it was shared. Emma had shown him the opposite. Time became more valuable when it belonged to people instead of schedules. Just then Sarah joined them carrying 3 cups of warm apple cider from the hospital cafe. She handed one to Daniel before smiling gently. "Emma tells everyone you are the busy man who learned how to slow down." Daniel laughed. shaking his head with grateful embarrassment. I think I am still learning. Sarah looked toward her daughter with unmistakable pride. We all are. As afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows, catching the faded red scarf resting across Emma's shoulders, Daniel quietly understood that success had never been about filling every hour. It had always been about making certain the hours that truly mattered were never left empty. Winter arrived quietly, covering Boston with fresh snow that softened rooftops, sidewalks, and busy streets alike. Inside Daniel Brooks's company, however, something far greater than the changing season had transformed. The once silent executive floor now welcomed laughter during shared lunches. Volunteers organized monthly visits to children's hospitals, and every conference room included one empty chair with a small handwritten card that read, "Remember the person before the position." New employees often asked about the unusual tradition, and those who had been there longer simply smiled before answering. It reminds us why we are here. Daniel never explained the full story. He believed the lesson mattered more than the storyteller. Every Thursday afternoon remained reserved for the same calendar entry. People first. Nobody questioned it anymore. In fact, many executives began creating similar appointments on their own calendars. One snowy afternoon, Daniel arrived at the hospital carrying a large wooden display built by local craftsmen. It stood taller than the old bookshelf and included dozens of shelves designed especially for children, along with a small reading nook lined with soft cushions beneath a window overlooking the snow-covered courtyard. Volunteers gathered excitedly as it was carefully placed beside the waiting area windows. Emma walked into the lobby wrapped in her familiar faded red scarf and stopped in complete surprise. Her bright blue eyes widened as she slowly approached the beautiful new library, running her fingers gently across the polished wood. "Did you build this for us?" she asked softly. Daniel knelt beside her. "I only asked for it to be built. You were the one who taught everyone here that stories deserve a proper home." Emma studied the new shelves, already imagining where each book belonged. She noticed a small brass plaque fixed near the top of the largest shelf and leaned closer to read it aloud. "Borrow hope. Return kindness." Her eyes glistened as she turned toward Daniel. "That is exactly how it feels every time I come here." Together they spent the rest of the afternoon arranging books by color, then by size, then finally by whatever order made Emma laugh the hardest. Volunteers and nurses stopped by throughout the day, admiring the transformation and thanking Daniel quietly, though he always redirected the gratitude back toward Emma. Before leaving that evening, Emma placed a small brass lighthouse bookmark inside the very first book on the highest shelf, explaining that lighthouses always belonged where hope needed the most light. As snow drifted gently past the windows and the hospital lobby glowed with warm lamplight, Daniel realized that the modest stone bench where they first met had somehow grown into something far larger than either of them could have imagined, a place where an entire community had learned to notice one another again. 1 year later, the first Monday of autumn arrived with the same crisp air that had filled the streets on the morning everything changed. Boston awakened beneath a sky painted in soft shades of gold, and the sidewalks outside Daniel Brooks's office tower bustled with familiar routines. Executives hurried toward meetings carrying coffee and briefcases. Parents walked children to school. Volunteers entered the neighboring medical building with warm smiles. From a distance, it looked like any other ordinary day. Yet Daniel knew that ordinary days often carried the greatest opportunities. As his black sedan stopped beside the entrance, Rachel opened the car door with a smile that had become familiar over the past year. "You have your quarterly investor meeting in 30 minutes, she said. Daniel nodded before stepping onto the sidewalk. Then, almost by instinct, he looked toward the same stone bench where he had first met Emma. It was empty now, but seeing it still made him pause. Not because he was remembering sadness, but because he remembered the moment his life quietly changed direction. Instead of walking straight into the office, he crossed the plaza toward the hospital entrance as he did every Thursday, and, whenever possible, on many other mornings as well. Inside the bright lobby, the library had become one of the most beloved places in the building. Children gathered around colorful bookshelves while parents exchanged encouraging smiles. The wooden sign reading "Borrow Hope. Return Kindness" welcomed everyone who entered. The little brass lighthouse bookmark rested inside the first book exactly where Daniel had placed it months earlier. It had become a symbol that many families quietly recognized. Emma was already there, now a little taller than before, her familiar faded red scarf still wrapped gently around her shoulders. She was helping a younger child choose a storybook, kneeling patiently until the little boy smiled with confidence. When she noticed Daniel, her face brightened immediately. "Good morning," she said happily. "Good morning," he replied. "You are here early." She laughed softly. "Books do not like waiting." Daniel smiled because that sounded exactly like something Emma would say. Sarah soon joined them, healthier and stronger than the year before, carrying a tray of warm apple cider for everyone volunteering that morning. Looking around the cheerful library filled with stories, laughter, and quiet acts of kindness, Daniel realized that none of this had been created by money alone. It had been built one conversation, one shared hour, one thoughtful decision at a time. Before leaving for his office, Emma reached into her little notebook and carefully tore out a single page. She handed it to Daniel with the same gentle smile she had worn on the very first day they met. He unfolded it slowly. In careful handwriting she had written, "The world changes every time someone decides another person is worth their time." Daniel folded the page and placed it inside the breast pocket of his suit beside his heart. Then he adjusted the faded red scarf that Emma had briefly draped across his arm while helping another child, returning it to her with grateful care. As he finally walked toward his office tower, he noticed people holding doors for strangers, volunteers greeting nervous families, children discovering hopeful messages inside library books, and coworkers smiling at one another before beginning their day. He understood now that success was never measured by how many meetings filled a calendar or how many floors an office occupied. True wealth was measured by the lives quietly brightened because someone chose compassion over convenience. And every time Daniel looked at an empty space on his calendar marked people first, he remembered that the most valuable appointment of his life had begun with 3 whispered words that almost nobody else had heard, proving that the smallest voice could awaken the greatest heart.